So we're going to continue our discussion on the big question, am I paid fairly? But this time we're not going to focus on it from an ethical point of view or from an organizational point of view or even a justice point of view, but from a legal point of view. So am I paid fairly, or probably the better title is legally, by law? So first let's talk about how the federal court system works, and then we'll talk about how the state court system works. So fundamentally, the way the court system is organized, it's hierarchical. So you begin at the U.S. District Court, which is a trial court. And as you know, at the trial court, they decide facts. So they look at all the evidence, they look at what's admissible, and they are the judges there, the juries are trier of facts. And then what happens is if you are the losing party at the U.S. District Court, a trial court, then you file an appeal. So when you file an appeal, if an appeal is granted, then you move up to the United States Court of Appeals. So once it moves up to the appellate division, it's no longer a trier of fact, but it focuses on errors in the law. So errors in the law. And let's assume that you're not satisfied with the verdict that was rendered by the judge or the jury at the United States Court of Appeals. Then you can submit what's called a writ of certiorari, kind of Latin words for, hey, U.S. Supreme Court, will you hear the case? And the United States Supreme Court will not hear every single case. They will hear those cases that will have a public policy aspect, maybe a public interest aspect, or that are critical to the further interpretation of the United States Constitution. So when you're filing something within the United States court system at the federal level, the first point is U.S. District Court, trial court. Then if you're not satisfied, then you go up to the United States Court of Appeals. And then if you're not satisfied, maybe the United States Supreme Court. So the decision is this: do I file something in a federal court or a state court? So there are certain occasions where you have a choice. There are other occasions where you do not. So since DePaul primarily is housed within the state of Illinois, let's look at the state of Illinois court system. But all the other 49 states have a similar hierarchical model. So similar to the federal courts, you have trial courts, but they're called circuit courts. And the reason why they're called circuit courts is judges used to actually kind of ride around on horses, and they would make the circuit to hear cases. That's no longer the case, but it could be in the future, who knows. Then if you're not satisfied with that particular verdict, then you can file an appeal. We're appellate court. And if you're not satisfied with that, then you can file yet another appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court. And if there's a conflict between federal and state law, then sometimes the Supreme Court cases at the state level can go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's very important as an HR professional, it's very important when you look at compensation and benefits that you have at least a basic understanding of how the court system works at both the federal level and the state level. So again, let's focus on, am I paid fairly? So I have some data here for post-MBA average salaries. Now there's something wrong with this. So as individuals that are studying compensation, you should never, any VER, underline, underscore it, never use average. You should always use the median. And the reason why you should never use average compensation is you may have a very high outlier or a very low outlier, and what happens is you get skewness, positive skewness or negative skewness. Hence, the median is the best way to do it, but many magazines like Forbes, for example, they're not compensation professionals, so you'll often see the average. But let's take a look at this data. So this is 2017 Forbes Best Business Schools. So we have men and we have women. So if you look at healthcare, so men 100,958, women 97,891. Pretty close. The gap is 3%. Let's go down all the way to the bottom, management. Men 136,939. Women 100,690. $36,000 difference, or 36%. So what accounts for that gap between men and women? And if you notice, in every single profession, there's a gap. But some professions have a higher gap than others. So researchers have looked at what explains the gap. So let's take a look at this. Educational attainment explains some of it. But in the Forbes slide, let me go back to that, they all have MBAs. So it's probably not educational attainment. Let's look at occupation. So you can see here, if we go back to the Forbes, clearly you can see the occupational differences. So that makes sense. I don't agree with it, but it makes sense. Let's look at industry. So if you go back here, there is a relationship between the occupations and the industries. So that kind of makes sense, although I don't agree with it. Then you look at labor force experience. So maybe the men have more experience than the labor force, perhaps. It's also union status. So maybe the manufacturing sector, maybe a little bit more unionized. Race and ethnicity have a role to play. But what's interesting to me is that these gaps, 41% of the gap is not explained. Not explained. So it's not explained by educational attainment, not explained by occupation, not explained by industry or labor force or any of that other stuff. So I want to ask you this question is, what do you think is in that unexplained? What's in the unexplained bucket? What's there? So I think part of what's there are the isms. Yep, so it could be sexism. It could also be disabilityism, all forms of isms. I think the isms are in that unexplained. So it's important to recognize, although we are kind of in current history, if you will, is the gender gap persists. There's also a racial gap. There's an ethnicity gap. So am I paid fairly? We're going to get to the point where I'm going to ask the question is this legal or illegal to have these gaps? So now let's look at another study. So here they controlled for education. Then they looked at what are the differences between men and women with regard to bachelor's degrees. And here they cite the median, which is good, hourly earnings. So if you look for men, Asian men, high, $35 an hour. If you look for women, Asian women, $27 an hour, followed by whites and then whites. And then for the blacks and the Hispanics, they're low. They switched, but they're still low. So again, what accounts for those differences, and are they legal or illegal? That's the question. Now let's look at religion. So now we're going to look at individuals that are of the Islamic faith or Muslim. So these are the allegations that they filed in 2009. So these are allegations to the EEOC. If you go down to the second from the bottom, it says wages. So there were 28 claims for wages, which falls under comp and benefits. So now so is that legal or is that illegal? So we're going to come to that. So since you're all in the HR profession, or most of you might say HR is different because we're enlightened and we know better and we know about what the laws are, and we're just different than the other occupations. So with regard to gender, looking at it from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're not so enlightened. So let's look at median, again, good median, not average, weekly earnings for HR managers. Men, $1,737 weekly. Women, $1,283, about a $500+ difference. Pretty significant, because that's weekly. That's about $2,000 a month, and 2,000 times 12 is about $24,000 a year. If you work 10 years, that's $250,000. So that's a substantial amount of money. Let's look at HR workers. So 1,364 for men and 1,089 for the women. Still substantial difference. So what accounts for that? Is it legal and or illegal? So now let's get at looking at the law. So Title under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 states this in the opening. No person in the United States shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, and then subsequently a lot of other protected categories were added, be excluded from participation, be denied the benefits, compensation, benefits, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this law is not restricted to that, but for those that do, it really highlights that fact. So what does discrimination look like? So it comes in 4 basic categories. You have disparate treatment, which I shall define later. You have disparate impact, which I also shall define later. You have harassment and retaliation. So with regard to am I paid fairly by the law, what's most important for comp and benefits is the treatment and the impact. So what's disparate treatment? So disparate treatment is this. Let's say I'm the manager. So I have a female candidate and have a male candidate. Let's assume they have the same, undergraduate preparation. They both finished the DePaul MSHR. They both have equivalent years of experience. So I have a preference, let's say, for the man. So what I do is I give the man an offer that is $20,000 more than the woman. So that's called disparate treatment. So I'm treating one individual different from another individual, and I'm knowingly doing this based upon a protected category. So it could be religion, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be national origin. My example was gender. The other is disparate impact. So disparate impact is when you add up all the individual decisions, and based upon adding up all those individual decisions, is there a statistically significant difference between the way some employees are treated, as defined by protected categories, and others? And then if you remember kind of quantitative reasoning, is you do a chi-square analysis, is the analytic tool that you use to determine whether there's a statistically significant difference. So Walmart was one particular company where they found that among their store managers. What they found is that there were considerable wage differences between the male and the female store managers, not one-on-one, but in the aggregate. So I want to highlight an act called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. So we talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But what happens is Congress may hear about, or lobbyists may say, what about this particular issue? They may sponsor legislation, then that legislation turns into law. So let me read some of the language from the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. That's a tough one to say. You try to say that. Each paycheck that delivers discriminatory, hear the word again, disparate treatment, individual, disparate impact groups, is a wrong actionable under the federal EEO statutes, again, going back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, regardless of when the discrimination began. So this was the case with Lilly Ledbetter. So Lilly Ledbetter worked in a manufacturing environment. And unbeknownst to her, until she was getting ready to retire, she didn't know that she's receiving less than a similarly situated man. And she'd been working for the company for probably 20, 25 years. But when she was getting ready to retire and they calculated her defined benefit, which is based upon all the other years of experience, she notices, wow, I have been underpaid. And what happened is not only was she underpaid every single year, but that was going to impact her retirement. So that's why this particular act came into being and said, regardless of when the discrimination began, because prior to this law, you had a statute of limitations, which means is you have to know that you were discriminated against, and you have to file an allegation within a window of time. So this act said some people don't know that they're being discriminated against. It could be 2 decades ago. So that way we're going to close the statute of limitations, so that way that whenever it began, they can file a claim. So that's why this particular act was landmark act. So now let's go also to another act. So we have Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have Lilly Ledbetter, and we also have the Equal Pay Act. So under this act, employers can establish different wage rates, pay people differently, based upon seniority. So, you've been here 7 years, someone else been here 3 years, 7-year person gets more money. Fine. Based upon merit, performance. You sell twice as much as the other person, you get paid more. You have higher satisfaction ratings, you get paid more. You're on 7 more committees, you get paid more. Fine. That's also quantity and quality of output. But a differential based on anything is okay, but gender. So you cannot pay people differently based upon gender, based upon the same or similar job. Same or similar job. So when you go back to those earlier slides that I showed you, the HR slides, the MBA slides, it's clear to me is that those are illegal actions. So in answering the question, am I paid fairly by law? Probably the answer is I'm not. So it is both not fair, nor is it legal as well. The other thing you have to take a look at with regard to am I paid fairly by law is what's called exempt and non-exempt with the FLSA. And the FLSA is what? Fair Labor Standards Act. So employees are classified as exempt, which means they're exempt from the Fair Labor Standard Act. They're typically supervisors, managers, or salespeople, or they're non-exempt from the Act. If you're non-exempt from the Act, that means the Act applies to you. So if you're an hourly worker and say the standard work week is 40 hours and you work 45, so you get paid straight time for the 40, and then for the 41st, 42nd, 43rd, 44th, 45th, for those hours you get time and a half. So you have to watch out because some employees are not classified correctly. So they may actually work a large number of hours, but in working a large number of hours is they don't get overtime pay. So that's another example to the question is, am I paid fairly? The answer may be, no, I'm not, because I am misclassified under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So when you think about, am I paid fairly by law, think about it from two perspectives. So one perspective as an HR professional, because you may have to defend the organization, you may have to defend your managers. And also think about it from yourself as just being an employee. You want to make sure that you're treated fairly and legally by the law, which means you have to know a little bit of something about the law. So with that, thank you very much.